Look, video games were a huge part of my life. Past tense. I'm now 42 years old. I'm not going to tell you they're a huge part of my life now or that they're going to be in the future tense. But the one aspect of playing video games that still means something to me, that I can still positively appreciate to this day, is the music. You know, a couple months ago, I had a conversation with Tommy Tallarico. We talked a lot about veganism. We talked a lot about politics. We talked a lot about the history of video games. But I said to him, look, whenever I go back to play video games from my childhood, whether that's out of curiosity or nostalgia, I find myself sitting there thinking, how can anyone waste 5 minutes of their time with this tedious, pointless, repetitive task? Like, if you were paying me money to play Zillion for the Sega Master System, you couldn't compel me to do it today. I'd rather work at Starbucks. I'd rather work at McDonald's. I'd rather work in the warehouse for Amazon.com than sit here and play Zillion for the Sega Master System, even if I were being paid to do it. It's shockingly meaningless to go back and play those video games today that you remember from childhood. But the aspect of video games that for me still really has, it's aged well. It still really holds up today is going back and hearing that music again. And a lot of the time when I hear that music, I can hear the beginnings of my own interest in hip-hop music, in funk music, in soul, even in jazz. For many of us, the main way we learned about music was through video games, and we started playing video games long before we began dancing or singing or learning to play musical instruments ourselves. And here's the thing. When I look back at the Super Nintendo, let me tell you, I put it right at the bottom of my tier list. So I'm letting you know here by putting this first in the video. I have some very strongly held opinions. And coming back to Tommy Tallarico, you can directly compare award-winning soundtracks he made that were ported to both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. And I would say that in every single case, it's the Genesis soundtrack that's better. But you know what? This isn't comparative. The music on the Super Nintendo is trash, period. You don't have to compare it to the Genesis. You don't have to compare it to anything else. I would even say that the original 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, or if you really want to say the original Famicom in Japan, that had better music than the Super Nintendo. And I've got to tell you today, if you're going through the library of greatest hits, of the most outstanding soundtracks, the most outstanding music for the NES, it is so much deeper. It is so much more impressive than music on the Super Nintendo. Now, with that having been said, the library of games for the Nintendo and Famicom, for the 8-bit systems, it's such a huge library of games that I have to admit the percentage of those games that have an outstanding or great soundtrack, it's very small. At this point already, I think you have a sense of what a strongly opinionated tier list this is going to be. You won't be surprised to hear that for me, the Genesis is very close to the top, rank A on the tier list. You tell me if you can name a single other video game that has stood the test of time the way ToeJam and Earl has, where that soundtrack today You could play it on the radio. And it wasn't just influenced by funk music. It wasn't just influenced by what was going on in hip-hop and rap music. It was influential. It was influential for a whole generation of hip-hop artists who grew up playing Toe Jam and Earl long before they learned to dance, or long before they learned to scratch records on a turntable, or went on to make music themselves. So yeah, the Genesis, from my perspective, has an outstanding library of music, and that has a lot to do with the fact that people like Tommy Tallarico were working with GEMS software, the actual specific editor. And yeah, if you dig around, you're going to find that before that software came out, even though the microchips were exactly the same, the music you had coming out for the Genesis was remarkably awful.
It's a mess! The tempo is shot. It's just a fucking mess.
Some of you who are long-term viewers of the channel might expect me to put the Neo Geo really high on this tier list. Something you may not know, the home console, the Neo Geo AES, had only mono sound, not stereo, and it takes a hit for that. Further, if you were going to judge this by the arcade version, which isn't really a fair comparison, the arcade machine, you could pretty much never hear the music. So music was not really SNK Corporation's focus or emphasis. So they end up quite a bit lower on the list than you might reasonably expect. And I've put there the new Neo Geo system, which lets you play the old games with HDMI and better sound output, one level higher, because the actual sound quality you're going to get out of an original Neo Geo AES console is actually really bad, and not even in stereo as mentioned. Nevertheless, when playing old games using the new hardware or using an emulator for Neo Geo, often enough you're going to say, wow, I can't believe how amazing the music is. People really did not appreciate what a great system Neo Geo was for music. And again, that's partly because you probably played these games standing upright in a pizzeria, or in a barber shop, and there was no way you could actually even hear the music. You just hear characters shouting at each other in Japanese and things exploding. But the total number of games in the Neo Geo library is small, and the total number of games with extraordinary or wonderful soundtracks is few. Oh, and here's the next generation, Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. And guess where they end up? Yes, the music on Saturn and N64 is really that bad.
Can you see the sun is shining on me? It makes me feel so free, so alive. It makes me want to survive.
Yes, I know you may have nostalgia. You may have rose-colored glasses, maybe specifically for the dulcet tones of Mario 64. Let me tell you, this was the period of time when computer programmers suddenly had new options, new possibilities. There were new things they could do, like having continuous vocals and realistic instrumentation, CD quality sound. And the fact that they could do those things tended to overshadow the question of whether or not they should do those things. That was a whole generation of better hardware, but much worse, dramatically worse soundtracks, terrible music in video games, and it's the generation with which I lost all interest in video games myself.
This car has a funny face. He can handstand when he needs to and stretch his arms out just for you.
In the year 2020, and still in 2021, there has been a huge revival of interest in the formerly obscure PC Engine, exported to the United States as the TurboGrafx 16, available in many different iterations, the Core Graphics 2, the Turbo Duo, etc., with or without CD sound. Most of you never encountered this system when you were children, so there is no nostalgia for it. You're encountering it for the first time now. Now there's a retro mini console out there, different ways to play the games through emulation and so on. Is the music that bad? Yes. On the original 16-bit console, the music really is that bad. And the CD-enhanced version of the console, it basically encounters the same problem as the Sega Saturn and the N64. But the surprise entry in this competition is the lowly black and white Nintendo Game Boy. For me, Game Boy stands out at the absolute top of this list. Some of you may have distant childhood memories of putting in the headphones to your Game Boy, and now when you reflect on it, you think, the music couldn't have really been that good. It couldn't have been, I must have just been young, I must have been naive, I didn't have sophisticated taste then. Go back and listen. You will be astounded. Now, this video has not been too burdened with lengthy excerpts from the soundtracks being contrasted here, but I'm going to play for you now a significant portion of Puyo Puyo 2's main theme song, and we're going to directly contrast the Super Nintendo version, the Sega Genesis version, and the Game Boy version. And guess which one wins. Guess which one stands out as by far the best version of this soundtrack. The portable Game Boy system had a terrible screen, terrible controls. It had a very simple version of Z80 architecture, and there were a lot of programmers around who knew how to get the most out of it and who knew how to make the best possible music on that very limited system. But if there is one console that never ceases to amaze and astonish me, where if you put on just any YouTube video discussing this console with any set of random games from its past, you will be astounded again and again at how much great music was gotten out of a limited chipset. It is the Commodore 64. Commodore 64 stands at the absolute top of this list, despite the fact that the games are absolutely incredibly awful. The vast majority of games on Commodore 64 today are unplayable, or they are only playable as kind of historical curiosities. Like, oh, isn't it amazing that they managed to make a version of the Simpsons arcade game that works on Commodore 64? And I am amazed. It is amazing. It's incredible with such limited hardware that they did. Isn't it interesting that they managed to make a version of Arkanoid for Commodore 64, that they managed to make a version of Double Dragon, that all of these games had a highly inventive Commodore 64 version, struggling against the limits of that hardware. But the one aspect of the experience that lasts, that's still entertaining or even inspiring today, is the music. The music has aged unbelievably well. And yeah, there is a hole in the middle of this list, so I might as well poke in the system that I knew best from my own childhood here. I would put the 8-bit Sega Master System there at rank D. To be fair to the Sega Master System, it is home to some of the greatest 8-bit games ever made, and frankly, some of the greatest video games of all time, things like Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap. However, the number of those games is incredibly few, the total number of games on the system is few, and the number of games with excellent or outstanding soundtracks is very few also.
Talk Boss featuring words that kill. My slang is editorial, explicit material. Briefcase show, live and stereo flow. Feel me, Donna Realty, set the black people free.
In ending this video, I just want to say that a friend of mine, someone who's known me for many years, and someone who knows that I feel that adults should not play video games, not unless you're sitting down to play with your children, or at any rate, you should try to limit the number of hours you're spending on video games to being as close to zero as possible. A friend of mine for many years admitted to me that he does in fact own a Nintendo Switch, and he has in fact been playing each and every Pokemon game that came out for the Switch, adding up to many dozens or many hundreds of hours, I imagine. And this has been a lifelong habit for him, system to system, throughout his adult years. He's kept up with the Pokemon series. I'd say that if you're not willing to make the decision to quit video games outright, I think you should reflect on how much your own life would improve if you picked a date on the calendar and said, I am not going to play any video games made more recently than 1995. 1995 is in some ways an arbitrary year. If you start looking at the history of video games, you might feel that you need to nudge it ahead to 1997 or nudge it back to 1993. But as you reflect on this possibility, how your own life would change, how what you'd do with all the hours in the day you'd reclaimed by eliminating video games from your life, think about how much better your life would be if instead of 1995, it were 1985. The truth is that the more you can limit yourself to playing graphically simple games, games that were designed to be played in an arcade for just 5 or 10 minutes, rather than games that were designed to be played on a home console for 5 or 10 hours at a stretch, the better your life will be. If you can't achieve absolute zero gaming in your life, I think you have to look at meaningful ways to limit video gaming, both qualitatively and quantitatively.